Imagine a world where your family, your community, and even your faith are ripped apart by forces beyond your control. This is the world of the Reformed Protestants in the 16th century. Persecution, exile, and the relentless pursuit of the Catholic Church turned their lives upside down. But in the midst of this chaos, a surprising truth emerged. The very things that should have destroyed them, persecution and exile, actually created a complex, interconnected web of relationships that kept them alive. In 1553, a group of Dutch and French Protestants fled their homes, seeking refuge in the city of London. They were not just running from the threat of death, they were leaving behind everything they knew. Families were torn apart, and the familiar faces of their communities were replaced by strangers. Yet, in this new city, they found a strange comfort. They were not alone. Other exiles, from different countries and different backgrounds, were there too. They shared a common language of suffering and a shared hope for a better future. The Reformed movement, often called Calvinism by historians, was not a monolithic entity. It was a web of relationships, a network of people who supported each other through the trials of exile. Some were Calvinists, some were Lutherans, and some were just broadly Protestant. They didn't always agree on everything, but they found strength in their shared experiences and their shared identity as Christians. One of the most striking examples of this web is the story of Johan Rengers van ten Post. He was a nobleman from the Netherlands who fled to the city of Emden in Germany. In Emden, he found a community of exiles from various parts of Europe. They were all trying to make a new life, but they also faced new challenges. They had to navigate the political landscape of their new home, deal with the authorities, and sometimes even compromise their beliefs to survive. Despite these challenges, they formed a strong community, supporting each other through the hard times. The Reformed exiles developed a wide variety of intellectual responses to their experiences. Some saw their lives mirrored in the hardships of the ancient Israelites, while others felt a profound sense of being abandoned by God. Some used John Calvin's doctrine of predestination for comfort, but many found other ways to cope. They wrote letters, sermons, and books, sharing their thoughts and struggles with each other. This exchange of ideas and support was a crucial part of their survival. Exile was not just a physical journey, it was a journey of the soul. The exiles were forced to confront new ideas and make compromises they never thought possible. They had to communicate over long distances, often facing censorship and seizures of their letters. They had to adapt to new cultures and new ways of life. In this process, they developed multiple overlapping identities. They could be strong in their Reformed faith in one area of life, but also express a broader pan-Protestantism, or even a shared Christian identity in others. The term international Calvinism was invented by historians in the 20th century. The earliest usage dates back to 1927, but the broader term Protestant international came into use in 1959. These terms describe a real and coherent movement, but they also oversimplify the complexity of the Reformed experience. The Reformed movement was not more successful or deep than international Lutheranism or international Catholicism. It was distinguished by its lack of definition in terms of specific institutions, beliefs, or ritual behaviors. The Reformed exiles were not more firm in their faith or more confessionally committed than other Christians. They were just as human, just as flawed, and just as capable of developing multiple, sometimes contradictory identities. This is why the history of Reformed Protestantism in the early modern era is so rich and so complex. It is a story of people who, despite the challenges, found ways to survive and thrive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. The web of relationships that the Reformed exiles created was not perfect, but it was powerful. It allowed them to navigate the complexities of exile and to build a new life in a new world. This web is the heart of the Reformed story, and it is a story that continues to resonate today. When Claude Lévi-Strauss first arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 1934, he carried with him a book that would shape his understanding of the people he met. This book was Jean de Léry's History of a Voyage to the Land of Brazil, published in Geneva in 1578. Léry's account of his journey to Brazil is more than just a travelogue. It's a window into how early Calvinists viewed the New World and its inhabitants. Jean de Léry was a French Huguenot, a follower of John Calvin, and a pastor. In 1555, he joined a group of Huguenots on an expedition to Brazil, led by Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. The goal was to establish a French settlement trade with the local Tupinamba people, and possibly create a safe haven for Huguenots fleeing religious persecution in France. Léry and his companions arrived on an island near what is now Rio de Janeiro, but their stay was short-lived. The commander, Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon, demanded that they follow Catholic practices, which the Huguenots refused. Fearing for their lives, Léry and his friends escaped to the mainland and spent 2 months living among the Tupinamba before returning to France. Léry wrote his book, History of a Voyage to the Land of Brazil, during a time of intense religious conflict in France, known as the Wars of Religion. His account is filled with detailed observations of the Tupinamba, from their physical appearance to their social customs. Léry describes the Tupinamba as strong and healthy, often naked except for feathers, during ceremonies. They had unique ways of greeting each other, such as showing their backsides, and they drank a fermented beverage called kawen, made from chewed roots mixed with spit. One of the most striking aspects of Léry's account is his comparison of Tupinamba customs to those of Europeans. He often portrays the Tupinamba in a positive light, emphasizing their honesty and simplicity. For example, he notes that their nakedness was innocent and free from the lust and pride that often accompanied European fashion. He also describes their feasts, which lasted for days, as joyful and communal, unlike the gluttony and excess he saw in Europe. Léry's observations are not just descriptive. They are also critical of European society. He points out that the Tupinamba's way of life, while different, was often more virtuous than that of Europeans. He criticizes European chauvinism, especially when it comes to warfare. The Tupinamba fought for honor and tribal pride, while Europeans fought for land and wealth, using advanced but brutal weapons. Léry even suggests that the Tupinamba's practice of cannibalism, though horrific, was more merciful than the torture and imprisonment practiced by Europeans. Léry's account is particularly interesting because it shows a humanist and Calvinist perspective on the New World. Unlike later Protestant writers, who often saw non-Europeans as primitive and in need of conversion, Léry approaches the Tupinamba with curiosity and respect. He uses his observations to critique the violence and hypocrisy of European society, especially during the Wars of Religion. For example, he compares the Tupinamba's swift and merciful killing of enemies to the brutal and prolonged torture practiced by Europeans. He also references the atrocities committed during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where Catholics killed thousands of Protestants in France. Léry's book became very popular, published in multiple languages, and widely read. It influenced later explorers and writers, including Lévi-Strauss, who used it as a reference for his own anthropological work. Léry's humanist approach to the Tupinamba, combined with his Calvinist faith, provides a unique perspective on the early encounters between Europeans and the peoples of the New World. his account reminds us that the ways we view and interact with others are shaped by our own cultural and religious backgrounds, and that these interactions can be both revealing and due. Jean de Léry, a French Huguenot, spent time in Brazil and wrote about his experiences in a book called Voyage to Brazil. His observations were not just about the Tupinamba, the native people he encountered, but also about the behavior and morals of Europeans, especially the French. Léry used the Tupinamba as a mirror to reflect the darker aspects of European society, particularly the greed and violence that he saw as common among the elite. Léry noticed that the Tupinamba had a deep fear of thunder and believed in an evil spirit they called Ignan. This fear showed that they had a sense of a moral order and a belief in good and evil, which Léry saw as evidence of a basic religious instinct. He believed that all people, no matter where they were from, had this instinct, a concept he borrowed from John Calvin, the founder of Calvinism. Calvin argued that everyone has a natural sense of a higher power and a moral conscience, even if they don't understand it fully or act on it correctly. Léry tried to teach the Tupinamba about Christianity and urged them to stop their cannibalistic practices. He saw their rituals as a form of violence, much like the violence he witnessed among Europeans. The Tupinamba, however, were not easily convinced. They promised to change, but quickly returned to their old ways. Léry also observed that the Tupinamba had their own spiritual leaders, called Caribes, who claimed to communicate with spirits and performed rituals. Léry saw these leaders as impostors similar to the mendicant friars in France, who claimed to perform miracles for alms. Despite the Tupinamba's lack of a clear understanding of a Christian God, Léry believed they had the potential to learn and grow in their spiritual understanding. He thought they were more open to spiritual discussions than many Europeans who had become atheists or Epicureans, believing that there was no God or that God did not care about human affairs. Léry saw the Tupinamba as having a seed of religion that could be nurtured, while many Europeans had lost their way. Léry's book was not just a travelogue. It was a critique of French society. He wanted to show that the Huguenots, despite being outsiders in France, were loyal and capable citizens. He argued that the Huguenots, like the Tupinamba, had virtues that were often overlooked by the Catholic majority. Léry believed that the Huguenots, who were often persecuted, deserved tolerance and respect. He used the example of the Tupinamba to highlight the moral failings of the French, suggesting that the violence and greed of the French were more barbaric than the practices of the Tupinamba. Léry's ideas influenced other writers, such as Michel de Montaigne, who used Léry's account to criticize the greed and violence of Europeans. Montaigne famously wrote that it was more barbaric to treat a person cruelly while they were alive than to eat them after they were dead, a reference to the way Europeans treated heretics and enemies. The Huguenots' experiences in Florida, led by Jean Ribault and René Guélain de la Denière, echoed Léry's observations. They, too, encountered native peoples, the Timucuans, and wrote about their religious beliefs and practices. The Huguenots in Florida, like Léry, saw the Timucuans as having a basic religious conscience, but they also noted the Timucuans' generosity and kindness. The Huguenots in Florida faced similar challenges, including internal conflicts and the threat of Spanish attack. When the Spanish finally arrived, they massacred the Huguenots, sparing only a few skilled workers and Catholic mariners. The Huguenots' accounts of their experiences in the New World, whether in Brazil or Florida, were not just about the native peoples they encountered. They were also about the Huguenots themselves and their place in French society. These accounts were a call for tolerance and a reminder that even those who were different could have virtues worth recognizing. The early French Huguenots who landed in Florida were captivated by the Timucuan Indians. they found the Timucuans to be physically impressive, describing them as tall, well-built, and handsome. The Timucuans had unique customs that the French found both intriguing and sometimes bizarre. For example, they ate insects and dirt, which seemed strange to the European settlers. Despite these differences, the French were struck by the Timucuans' beauty and charm. The Timucuans were also known for their social graces, such as their polite and dignified behavior, especially their tribal leaders. The Timucuans were initially very friendly to the French. They helped the settlers build Fort Caroline and shared their food and medicines. They even invited the French to their ceremonies and discussions about tribal affairs. The French were amazed by the Timucuans' curiosity and willingness to learn about their religious practices. The Timucuans would join the French in prayer, raising their hands to the sky just as the French did. However, the relationship between the French and the Timucuans eventually soured. The French, led by their commander, Laudonnière, tried to form an alliance with a powerful neighboring tribe, which upset the chief, Saturia. The French also began to make harsh demands for food and supplies, which strained the relationship. Some French colonists even turned to piracy, which further damaged their reputation among the Timucuans. Laudonnière and other French writers blamed the deterioration of relations on the greed and dishonesty of their own people. They described how the French often failed to pay for the provisions they received, stole from the Timucuans, and even burned down their huts in fits of anger. The Timucuans, in turn, became wary of the French and began to withdraw their support. The Timucuans had their own religious practices, which the French found both fascinating and mysterious. They observed feasts and ceremonies that involved singing, dancing, and rituals led by their priests, known as Joannas. These priests were believed to have magical powers, such as the ability to heal the sick and predict the future. The Timucuans also worshipped the sun, which they believed brought them victory in battle. Despite these practices, the French noted that the Timucuans did not have a concept of a single transcendent God. One particularly interesting incident involved a stone column that the French had erected to mark their presence. The Timucuans began to worship this column, adorning it with offerings and kneeling before it. When the French returned, they were surprised to see the Timucuans treating the column as an idol. The French felt uncomfortable with this, but to maintain good relations, they reluctantly joined in the worship, which felt like a form of idolatry to them. The French Huguenots often used the Timucuans' social virtues to highlight the failings of their own people. They described the Timucuans as generous, hardworking, and kind, in contrast to the greed and laziness of some French colonists. They believed that the Timucuans, with the right guidance, could be brought to a more civilized and religious way of life. Over time, the way that Calvinists viewed indigenous peoples changed. Later Calvinists, such as those in New England, saw the Native Americans as descendants of ancient peoples and viewed their religions as corruptions of an original monotheism. They focused more on the negative aspects of Native practices, such as bloody rituals, and less on the positive social qualities that the early Huguenots had noted. The story of the French Huguenots in Florida is a complex one, reflecting both the beauty and the challenges of cultural encounters. It shows how the French, despite their initial admiration for the Timucuans, ultimately failed to build a lasting and respectful relationship. The Huguenots' accounts, however, provide a valuable insight into the early interactions between Europeans and Native Americans, highlighting the importance of mutual respect and understanding in such encounters. The early 1500s saw a major shift in how people thought about history, especially among the Calvinists. This shift wasn't just about defending a new religious movement, it was about creating a new way of understanding the past and the present. For the Calvinists, history wasn't just a series of events, It was a divine plan unfolding over time. In the 1530s, German reformers like Martin Luther and Philipp Melanchthon started writing history in a new way. They saw history as a grand story where God's plan was revealed through events. This wasn't just about the history of the church. It was about the history of the entire world. They used the Book of Daniel as a model, seeing history divided into 4 great empires, with the 4th empire being their own time, a time of crisis and the coming of the Antichrist. Luther and his followers saw themselves as the true defenders of the faith, fighting against the false church of the Pope, whom they believed was the Antichrist. This idea was also shared by radical Lutherans like Matthias Flacius Illyricus, who wrote a massive history called the Magdeburg Centuries. This work was like a battle cry, calling on true believers to fight against the corruption of the church. In the 1560s, John Calvin, the leader of the Calvinist movement, had a different take on history. While he agreed that the Book of Daniel was important, he didn't focus as much on prophecy. Instead, he saw history as a series of lessons and examples that could guide the faithful. Calvin believed that the true church could understand the meaning of history, even in the chaos of the present. He encouraged his followers to actively spread God's word and improve their lives. Jean Crespin, a French refugee in Geneva, played a key role in spreading Lutheran ideas to the French-speaking world. In 1556, he translated a major work by Johannes Leiden, a Lutheran historian, into French. This book, which told the story of the Reformation, was meant to show that God was guiding the church through history. Crespin also commissioned Jean de Léry to write a history of the church from the time of the apostles to the 16th century. Crespin's goal was to create a continuous history that linked the martyrs of the 16th century to the early Christian martyrs. Crespin's most famous work was the Livre des Martyrs, a book that told the stories of those who died for their faith. It was meant to inspire and strengthen the morale of the Calvinist communities who were facing intense persecution. The book became even more important after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when thousands of French Protestants were killed. Simon Goulart, who took over the editing of the book after Crespin's death, expanded it to include the anonymous victims of the massacres. He saw these events as part of a divine plan, where trial and suffering were followed by redemption. Goulart also edited the Chronicon Carrianus, another important historical work. In this book, he portrayed Martin Luther as a new champion of the true church, leading it out of the darkness of papal rule. Goulart saw Luther as part of a long line of God's chosen leaders, and the Reformation as the latest chapter in the history of the true church. The French Wars of Religion, which lasted from the 1560s to the early 1590s, created a sense of national crisis. Historians from both sides of the conflict tried to understand what was happening and find ways to end the violence. Some Calvinist historians like Lancelot Voisin de la Popelinière took a more secular approach, seeing the wars as a human tragedy. Others, like Simon Goulart and Theodore Beza, stuck to the traditional Calvinist view, seeing the wars as a divine test and a call to remain faithful. For Goulart and Beza, the trials of the present were part of a larger sacred history. They believed that by remaining true to their faith, the Calvinists could overcome their enemies and achieve a better future. This view helped to keep the faith alive during the darkest times of the wars. The way Calvinists wrote history had a lasting impact. Their focus on the divine plan and the idea of a continuous struggle between the true and false church shaped how people understood their place in the world. Even today, the idea that history is a story with a divine purpose continues to influence how some people see the past and the present. La Popelinière, a noble and military leader in the Huguenot camp, wrote his History of France in 1581. He based his work on the writings of Johann Slyden, a historian who wrote about the reign of Emperor Charles V. La Popelinière also drew from many Protestant historical narratives and tracts, but he didn't always cite his sources. This was common during the French Wars of Religion, a time when history was often used to support one side or the other. La Popelinière's history placed the French Wars of Religion in a broader context, focusing on the conflicts between the Valois and Habsburg dynasties and the broader European crisis of the Reformation. He wanted his history to be more than just a biased account. He aimed to base it on careful research and critical analysis of his sources, following the new historical methods promoted by scholars like Estienne Pasquier and Jean Baudin. In the opening of his book, La Popelinière followed the ideas of the German reformer, Martin Luther, describing him as a man of his times. However, he didn't portray Luther as a divine instrument. Instead, he emphasized the corruption of the Catholic Church and the personal failings of Pope Leo X as the main reasons for the Reformation. This approach was different from the more religious and prophetic tone found in many Protestant tracts. When it came to the spread of the Reformation in France, La Popelinière pointed to a long history of church corruption and a widespread desire for religious reform. He wanted to explain events through a chain of causes and effects, rather than just telling a simple story. La Popelinière's account of the events leading to the wars of religion in France was also different from the usual Protestant narrative. He focused on the political tensions between the Bourbons and the Guises, rather than seeing the conflict as a divine punishment or a final battle between good and evil. He presented the wars as a human tragedy caused by the stubbornness of both sides. La Popelinière's account of two key events, the massacre of Vassy in 1562 and the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, drew criticism from his Calvinist peers. He described the massacre of Vassy in a more neutral way, downplaying its importance. For the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, he provided a balanced analysis of the propaganda from both sides and suggested that the Huguenots were willing to die for their faith, seeing it as a path to glory. This approach did not sit well with many Calvinists, including Theodore Beza, who accused La Popelinière of stripping these events of their historical and religious significance. In 1581, the National Synod of the Reformed Churches of France condemned La Popelinière's work, calling it impious and full of lies. La Popelinière was forced to submit to the Synod and produce a corrected edition of his history. In contrast, Simon Goulart, a close ally of Beza, published his Mémoires de l'État de France sous Charles IX. In 1576, this book was a collection of annotated sources about the French Wars of Religion, presented as an objective account. However, it was actually a tool to rally Calvinists against the moderate discourse of Henry de Navarre, who would later become King Henry IV. Goulart included radical Calvinist tracts to encourage resistance and hope among the Huguenots, emphasizing the idea that God would eventually punish the persecutors and vindicate the faithful. Beza, in his Histoire ecclésiastique des Églises réformées au Royaume de France, published in 1580, also emphasized the idea of a sacred history. He saw the Reformation as a continuation of the struggle between the true church and the forces of the Antichrist. Beza's history was meant to comfort and instruct the Huguenots, portraying their suffering as part of a divine plan. He described the early evangelical movement in France, the little flock of Meaux, as following in the footsteps of the apostles and offering the first martyrs to the true church. Beza's account of the massacre of Vassy was particularly vivid, presenting it as the beginning of the civil wars and a sign of the coming battle between good and evil. He also included his own confession of faith, and Calvin's confession to emphasize the continuity of the Calvinist faith. Both Goulart and Beza saw history as a sacred narrative, a story of divine providence and the triumph of the true church. La Popelinière, on the other hand, tried to present a more human-centered and secular account of the events. Their differing approaches reflect the complex and often conflicting ways people tried to make sense of the chaos and suffering of their time. La Popelinière, a French historian from the 16th century, lived in a time of great turmoil and change. He was deeply concerned about the chaos and conflict around him, especially the religious wars that were tearing France apart. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who saw history through a religious lens, La Popelinière believed in a more secular approach. He wanted to understand and organize the events of his time in a way that made sense without relying on religious explanations. La Popelinière felt that the recent and current events were far more significant than those of the distant past. He believed that his first-hand experience as a Huguenot, a French Protestant, made him a better historian. He saw himself as a historian of the state, someone who could trace the events that had led to France's current state of crisis. He hoped that by understanding these events, he could help restore national unity and greatness. Unlike some Calvinist historians who believed in a divine plan and saw history as a series of preordained events, La Popelinière focused on the immediate past and the present. He believed that the religious divide in France needed to be overcome to reinstate national cohesion. He hoped that a new form of monarchist nationalism could achieve this. However, his vision was not shared by everyone, including Henry of Navarre, who would later become King Henry IV of France. In the 16th century, many Calvinist historians tried to make sense of the chaos around them by looking to the past. Some, like Goulart and Beza, integrated secular history into a sacred, providential history. They believed that current events were part of a divine plan, and that the true church, the community of the godly, had always been persecuted throughout history. This perspective provided comfort and meaning to the faithful, who saw their suffering as part of a larger, divine story. Calvinist historians in France and England often used the idea of a persecuted minority to explain their experiences. They saw themselves as part of a long line of people who had been oppressed for their faith, from the early Christians to the present day. This narrative was meant to inspire a sense of unity and purpose among the faithful, and to justify their struggles against what they saw as the forces of evil. In England, Protestant historians like John Bale and John Foxes also used this narrative to explain the history of the English nation. They argued that true Christianity had been present in England long before the arrival of the Roman Church, and that the English were part of a larger, providential story. Fox Acts and Monuments, also known as the Book of Martyrs, became a powerful tool for this narrative, documenting the persecution of Protestants and presenting them as the true successors of the early Christian martyrs. John Knox, in his History of the Reformation in Scotland, also adopted this apocalyptic narrative. He saw the Scottish Reformation as part of the ongoing struggle between the true church and the forces of the Antichrist. Despite the challenges and setbacks, Knox believed that the true church would ultimately prevail. However, as the Reformation progressed, some historians like Foxy and Knox began to distance themselves from national history and turned to a more universal ecclesiastical history. They saw the true church as a universal institution, not limited to any one nation. The faithful were seen as a stateless people, bound by their covenant with God. By the late 16th century, the painful experiences of the Reformation led Calvinist historians to seek comfort in the apocalyptic discourse. They saw the present as a continuation of the ancient struggles of the true church. This perspective provided a sense of purpose and hope in a time of great uncertainty. L'Apollinaire, however, stood out for his unique approach. He chose to desacralize French national history and propose a secular historical teleology. He believed that history could be understood and organized without relying on religious explanations, offering a different path to understanding the complex events of his time. In the last part of our story, we look at how Calvin and his followers changed the way people saw the world around them, especially through art and images. When Calvin came to Geneva, much of the old Catholic world with its saints and ceremonies was already gone. The big question was, what would take its place? Calvin believed that to understand yourself, you first had to understand God. He thought that God's presence could be seen in the world around us, but that people were often too blind to see it. For Calvin, the best way to see God clearly was through reading and listening to the Bible, which he believed was guided by the Holy Spirit. Calvin and his followers didn't just want to remove old images. They wanted to create a new way of living that reflected their beliefs. This meant changing how people thought about art and images. Instead of focusing on saints and religious figures, they emphasized the importance of everyday life and the natural world as a way to see God's presence. In Geneva, this new way of thinking led to changes in how the city looked. For example, gravestones were removed and used for building which might seem disrespectful today, but it was seen as a way to build a new, more godly community. Calvin also encouraged people to see the beauty in the world around them, not just in churches or religious art. This new way of thinking about images and art spread beyond Geneva. Calvinists in other parts of Europe, like the Netherlands and Scotland, also began to create art that reflected their beliefs. This included paintings of everyday scenes, landscapes, and even portraits that showed the dignity and worth of ordinary people. Calvin's ideas about seeing and understanding the world had a big impact on the way people lived and thought. He believed that by focusing on the Bible and the world around them, people could better understand God and live more meaningful lives. This new way of thinking helped shape the culture of the Reformation and influenced how people saw the world for generations to come.